Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. We're excited to have everyone with us. My name's Amy Perkins, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Assessment Tools here at Brooks Publishing. This webinar is on using the ASQ-3 and ASQ-SE with children and families from diverse backgrounds, and we're very happy to have ASQ co-developers Jane Squires and Elizabeth Twombly here with us to share a presentation about the tools. But first, I want to go over some housekeeping tasks. You're in listen-only mode for the webinar. But if you have any questions during the presentation, you can type them into the question box, or you can tweet them to @BrooksPubCo using hashtag #TalkAboutTools. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A. For best audio and screen quality, you may want to exit any unneeded programs. For the presentation, you also might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of the PowerPoint slides. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can just click the orange button again and the bar will pop back out. Also, we're recording the webinar and you'll receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email tomorrow. We'll also post a link to the recording on the Brooks Publishing website, and you're welcome to share that link with colleagues or other friends you think might be interested. So as I said, we're very happy to have Jane Squires and Elizabeth Twombly here with us. I'd like to take a chance now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Jane Squires has served as Principal Investigator on Research Studies at the University of Oregon on the ASQ system. She is a professor in special education, focusing on early intervention and early childhood special education. She directs the Early Intervention Program and is Associate Director of the University of Oregon Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Dr. Squires has directed national outreach training activities related to developmental screening and the involvement of parents in the assessment and monitoring of their child's development. In addition to her interest in screening and early identification, Dr. Squires directs the doctoral and master's level early intervention special education, personal preparation programs, and teacher courses in early intervention and special education at the University of Oregon. Elizabeth Twombly is a faculty member of the Early Intervention Program at the University of Oregon at Eugene. Prior to working in the field of early intervention, Ms. Twombly spent many years working with young children in environmental education, child care, and preschool programs on the East and West Coasts. She is a contributing author on the ASQ-3 and a co-author on the ASQ-SE. For more than 20 years, Ms. Twombly has served on the ASQ research team, and she trains across the nation and internationally on the implementation of developmental and social-emotional screening tools in home visiting programs and health and education settings. So we're very happy to have Jane and Liz here with us to share information about ASQ-3 and ASQ-SE.
Thank you, Amy. This is Jane. We're very happy to be here also and to be sharing with you on kind of what we've gathered on cultural considerations when using the ASQ and the ASQ-SE. And we're also pleased that you in the audience will have a chance to ask us questions, and I'm sure that you'll be able to contribute your experiences also, at least in some sort of setting, because so many people have used this in, across the world, and there's always more to learn and better ways to do developmental screening. So this first quote here is from Kathy Hepburn at the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development. A child grows in and through contextually based relationships. An assessment of her developmental status is affected by her cultural context, as well as the perspectives of the examiner and the reporting caregivers. And I think this is a really nice summary of the materials that we're going to present today, and how we really see assessment as a lens through which to see a child, and it's also very much affected by her environment, her cultural context, family values, and all those other considerations. And it makes screening a very complex process, but also very fun and very much related to interacting with different families with different cultural values. I think most of you in the audience know this, that in the United States that we really are just exponentially increasing our diversity. that we have many more Hispanics, Blacks, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and that by 2050 that whites will no longer be in the majority, that we will really have a minority majority and much diversity. And that for those of you working with young children, that 40% of children under 5 will be Hispanic. So we really have to look through this lens, I think, not only in assessment, screening, but for all our interactions with families and young children in terms of, there's not going to be one way to do things, but we're really going to have to look through that lens of diversity when we're interacting with families and young children. We have 3 main objectives today. We're briefly going to describe the ASQ-3 and the ASQ-SE. There's more information on the Brooks website, as well as at the end of this presentation we'll be talking about some training opportunities that Brooks will be offering. Second, we'll talk about the cultural considerations in using screening tools, and finally, just briefly, some of the research on the cross-cultural uses of the ASQ and the ASQ-SE. So the ASQ and the ASQ-SE are parent or caregiver-completed screening tools. We kind of use parent in a generic way, so that might be a grandparent, it might be a daycare provider, anyone who knows the child well and may be asked to complete a developmental screening questionnaire. These tools are parent completed, so that they really depend on the knowledge of the caregiver in looking at the child's current developmental status. It's a series of questionnaires for children from 1 month to 5.5 years old. And there's a lot of studies that show they're pretty accurate in identifying children at risk for developmental or social emotional delays. So screening, we're really saying this development, there may be some problems in this development, there may be some risk factors, and this child needs to go on for a further assessment. These are 2 pages from the ASQ and the ASQ-SE. On the left is the 18-month questionnaire. There's 5 domains in each questionnaire for the ASQ-3. These are 2 of the domains, and you can see some of the examples of items. Parents answer yes, sometimes or not yet. On the right-hand column is the ASQ-SE, where parents answer most of the time, sometimes or rarely or never. And they also check if they have concerns. The ASQ-SE was really asking much more in detail about social-emotional skills, social-emotional competence, and concerns that parents or caregivers may have about their child's development related to social-emotional skills. Okay, the domains I mentioned, there's 5 domains for the ASQ, the developmental ASQ. There's communication, so asking about language, receptive language, expressive language. Is the child kind of communicating with caregivers and with friends in the environment? Gross motor, so kicking, skipping, bicycling skills, tricycling skills. Fine motor are the much more small muscle skills of writing, and it might involve other things like buttons. Problem solving, can the child solve problems in the environment? And personal social, again looking at social emotional competence and interactions. The ASQ-SE, as I mentioned, is a questionnaire that looks much more in depth at the social emotional competence of a child and some of the, if there are any concerns that caregivers may have about the child. And we really recommend that these 2 tools be used in tandem. Not all programs can do that, but I think you really gain a perspective from looking at the child's general development as well as specific social emotional concerns, especially if caregivers or teachers have some concerns about the child's developmental status.
Hi, Jane. Can I interrupt you just for a brief moment?
Yes.
Can you try to talk a little louder? We're having, we've had a couple comments that you're a little hard to hear. So if you could just talk a little bit louder, that would help. Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is Liz. I'm going to talk a little bit about screening and what is screening and why do we do it and what are the potential challenges that may come up during the process. So we're talking about screening as opposed to other types of early childhood assessment processes that may occur. And screenings we are defining as a brief assessment procedure that is designed to identify children who should receive more intensive diagnosis or evaluation from a variety of agencies, including your Part C early intervention providers, early childhood special education, so your 3 to 5-year-old special education service providers, health, including your primary health care providers, and or in many communities mental health agencies that are becoming really aware of and able to meet the needs of very young children and their parents who are struggling with behavioral issues. So there's a variety of referral agencies that may be able to do that more intense evaluative process to determine if there really is a problem that needs to be addressed. So after completing the screening assessment process, we're really trying to answer the question, does this child need further evaluation? Do they need to be seen by another provider to do a much more in-depth type of assessment to determine if there really is a need that needs to be addressed and supports that need to be provided? So in many cases, when you look at a group of children, there tends to be, if you look at this group here on the left-hand side, there is a group of children that really clearly appear to be typical. Their caregivers, their parents, everyone who knows this child really sees them as being typical and competent and not struggling in their environment. And then on the right-hand side, there's often a much smaller subset of children that come in and clearly a lot of people have concerns. They just do not appear to be developing typically in any number of different areas of development. And yet there's this group that's potentially in between those two that is possibly underdetected for a variety of reasons. These children may be underdetected. And this next screen kind of shows how a screening process can help to determine who those children are who are somewhere in the middle. We're not quite sure whether their development is typical or not. And when we screen them, those are the children that we want to get a further look at. We want to potentially send them off to one of those agencies or providers who has more information about the concerns that or the questions that we are wanting answered. So this is why we do screening, because some kids are very clear that they're developing typically or not. We're trying to get at those children that fall somewhere in the middle and who we want to get more information about to make good decisions. Some of the challenges that come up when screening children from a variety of different backgrounds, including diverse racial backgrounds or potentially who may be in situations like their families are in transition or homeless, just all sorts of different backgrounds that may make their behavior and development look different. There's a number of challenges to assessing those children. And if the process is not done sensitively, these are the potential issues that may happen. This first one, the over-referral of children for special education services, has just been well documented in the literature as being a problem, especially when children get into school-age services. They may be being screened or assessed when they enter kindergarten with tools that are completely unfamiliar to them, being asked to do things that they've never been asked to do before. They may be assessed in languages that they have no familiarity with, and as a result they may look like they have a delay and then be put into a special education service when in fact it was more the process and the procedures used in assessing their development that were in error. Another potential problem is really under-referring children who might benefit from special education services. And this, you know, if you look at Part C, the services that are provided to very young children, birth to age 2, these children are in, you know, their homes and are being taken care of by their primary caregivers. And, you know, when those families may be coming from very different cultural backgrounds, they both may not be aware of the types of services that are out there. They may have a distrust, or just really not have any feelings that these types of services may be beneficial or something that might be helpful to them in caregiving their children. And so this is, since Part C is really considered a preventative type of program, you know, ultimately many of the children that we're referring to early intervention, we're hoping that we can support their development to the extent where they will not be needing services by the time they get into schools. It's really important to have culturally sensitive procedures to explain to families and help them, you know, both want to access services and provide those services in a way that is really sensitive to their culture and their beliefs and values about rearing their children. So we may have problems in either one of these cases to either over-refer children or not find and identify and provide services to families and children that may really benefit from them. So one of the nice things about both the Ages and Stages questionnaires and the social emotional version are that there are a lot of features that are just inherent within these tools that really help to make them more adaptable to a variety of cultures. They don't keep that potential process not without problems, but they do have some inherent things that make it potentially work a little bit better for providers. So one of the things is just the fact that these tools have very flexible administration methods, and this is true for both of the tools. The materials, how you present this information to parents ranges all the way from parents completing them independently in the mail, online, on their own, to really being supported in the administration of the tools by a provider or a community health worker who is familiar with the family's culture. So not having a ready, set, go kind of administration procedure that is always conducted exactly the same way allows for some of that adaptability and flexibility that can make it more appropriate for a number of families. Certainly different materials can be used. We are not very specific about the exact type of materials that have to be used in the administration of the developmental version of this tool, the ASQ-3. As some of you may know, diagnostic tools often come with a little kit of very specific materials that have to be administered in a very specific way and with exactly that very specific little red chair put in front of the child. So, you know, we do have a materials kit for the ASQ, but it's suggested, and really what we're trying to do with the developmental tool is say we're encouraging these types of materials be used, but use what the child is familiar with, maybe what they're using at home, and that they're comfortable with and can show their best and optimal performance with. You may also omit items if they're really inappropriate to the family. And this issue comes up with the tools that sometimes families omit items when they're completing them, and so really the providers need to be able to have a conversation with the parents about why those items were omitted. It may be due to they don't have the items at home, they don't have the materials to try them, or they didn't have time to try them. And that's one potential thing that's very simple to rectify by just providing those materials. But if the reason why they're omitting them is because they're really inappropriate for the family's culture, for a value that they may hold, then you may omit those items, and there are procedures for scoring different domains and allowing for those omissions without penalizing the child for not completing those items. So an example, I'm trying to think, well, our classic example of this is a mirror play item where, you know, young children often in many cultures really enjoy looking at their reflections, and many parents will play with their child looking into mirrors. And however, in some cultures over the years we have really found that this may potentially be a value that families do not encourage their young children to look into mirrors for really very deeply held beliefs around perhaps the child's spirit being taken from that mirror, or anyway, or their teeth may not grow in. That was when Jane was just saying. So different beliefs or values. And so what you don't want to do is bring a mirror and show it to a young child whose parents may hold some beliefs around that. So again, it's up to the provider to really tease out what the reason why these items are being omitted and see if it's a strong belief or value that the family is holding for why they don't want to do that item with their young child. We've also really tried to norm these tools with very diverse populations and populations that are reflective of the U.S. Census. So we do have many different families and children represented in our normative data and with our cutoffs. And so that certainly helps with the adaptability of the tools. You can also reframe questions. Obviously, the intent of the ASQ items is very important to keep to. However, there are times when items can be reframed for a family as long as the intent of the item remains the same. This is true for both of the tools. In both cases, we also really have a very strong component in the ASQ-3. There is a section, the overall section, which really looks at parent concerns, which parent concerns have been found to be very predictive of school-age learning problems and behavioral issues. So they're really important to pay attention to, but they also help because those concerns are coming from the family. They're coming from their cultural context and what they know about their child. And so it's very important to attend to those concerns. The ASQ-SE has a certain component of subjectivity that's inherent in behavioral assessment. So we want to know from that parent's perspective, from their cultural lens, from what they know and what they have sort of expected from their child in terms of behavior. This feels like a concern to me in the context that this child is embedded. So that really helps with the adaptability of that tool. And then the ability to get multiple caregivers' perspectives can be very helpful. And certainly you can do this with both the ASQ and the ASQ-SE is have a parent complete it. And when there are concerns, perhaps have another, if there's another caregiver who's involved and knows this child extremely well, for example, a teacher or a child care provider who has contact with the child for many hours of the week, you can also get that other perspective and really look at both of those to get a sense of what is going on for this child. So all of these different features are built into the system and can help providers use these tools in a way that is culturally sensitive. So we're going to talk a little bit about considerations in the whole process of screening, and this is outside of just the ASQ and the ASQ-SE, not only what we've done to try to make these tools more sensitive, but that screening really is a process, and the ASQ is relatively simple in and of itself. It's a simple tool potentially to administer and score, but the process of screening is what really has to be looked at when you're looking at doing something in a way that is culturally sensitive. From the very first introductions and meeting with the families and introducing just this whole concept of screening. Many cultures, the concept of sitting and asking children to answer questions and name colors, and this is not necessarily something people do all over the world. It's sort of a very Western type of way of coming up to a child and saying, hi, what's your name? Oh, what color is your shirt? And asking all these different questions. So the whole concept of how we assess children in this country is, it may not be universally what people do with very young children. So really kind of coming to some agreement or understanding of this concept of screening, why we're doing it, what we're going to do with the results is very important to address. So we're going to talk a little bit about just administration of the ASQ and the ASQ-SE, communicating results, how do you do that, and interpreting the scores and making referrals, following up with the family. All of these different things encompass the process of screening. So during the just basic introduction of the screening tool, what sort of issues may arise? A very important foundational issue is going to be, what is the family's home language? And are you prepared to go into that home and both meet with the family as well as assess the child in their home language? Really, all the research around this is that we need to be assessing children in the language that they are the most comfortable in, the one that they are going to show their best possible performance, and to both honor that and be prepared to be assessing the child for that. At the bottom there, it talks about cultural brokers, interpreters, or cultural brokers. Another term sometimes used for a cultural broker is a community health worker. So what we're talking about there is having someone within your agencies, when you have different cultural groups represented in your communities, so to be able to have someone who both really understands the culture of the family that you may be working with, and also really understands early intervention or early childhood special education and what these services are and what they mean, and can help you bridge that conversation with the family. Obviously, this is very ideal to have these types of folks working within your agency. Sometimes we've seen agencies that, a great person is someone who is from a certain cultural group who has received early intervention services or has received early childhood special education services and found it very, very useful, and was really supported within that agency, and so they can really talk to the family about the benefits of doing this and what that seemed like to make them feel at ease with what that potential service may look like. So, having these folks, an interpreter, what we're calling a cultural broker, which is just that person who can bridge the family's culture with this agency culture, it can be very useful. They can also help with this whole initial discussion about who needs to be involved in this meeting. In some families, the father may be the decision maker, or the grandparents may be the decision makers, or the mother must, so kind of having some sense of what you may expect within a home. It may or may not end up being what is true for that family, but the questions should be out there to be answered. What are possible customs when you go into a home or into a meeting with a family in terms of how you greet, how you dress, what may or may not be offensive to a family. And again, this issue about how they feel about screening, what they know about it, what they think about it. If a family's coming from maybe an immigrant to this country where, you know, the most important things were really survival and having enough food to eat, that this concept of looking at these minute skills of a child and how they're developing at 12 months of age really may not be on the top of their priority list. So again, just to have those early conversations with families and try to do it in a culturally sensitive way. During the actual administration of screening tools, there was a wonderful study done up in Canada through a partnership, and we've taken some information here from that particular group. And they did a lot of work with immigrant families as well as refugee families, and the PI on that project was Rebecca Gokiert, and these are some of the things they learned. They were using the ASQ within this research and ongoing in terms of a way of screening children and providing services to these families. And they learned a lot in this process, and these were some of the things, as well as things we've heard over the many years that people have implemented these with children. But you know, that these types of things, feeding, dressing, that there's, you know, many cultures that do not encourage that independence as early on as some Western families and may do, where they're handing children spoons, you know, when they're very young, and encouraging that independence as well as that independence in dressing. And many cultures, many families, many parents choose to really do these kind of caregiving activities with their young children much longer. And because of that, those children may not move to independence as quickly with those particular skills. And what's important for us to consider is we don't want to interfere with a very nice caregiving activity that's really nurturing this child. And it's very important to this parent-child bond by saying, oh, you know, stop feeding that child. Give them a spoon so they can try it themselves. Well, let's stop and think about the advice we're giving and really consider the benefits of how families are potentially and why they're doing the things they do with their children. Reading and writing tools, you know, again, may not be something that families are super familiar with giving very young children. We have an exercise we do often in trainings that's related to, you know, a child using crayons at 16 months, and many families may not consider giving their very young children crayons when they're very young. And again, it's for us to sort of tease out, is there a cultural reason behind this that we don't necessarily want to intrude on the values and beliefs of this family, or is it just parenting knowledge? Is it just parenting information that they'd be happy to do this type of thing with their child, but just hadn't really considered the developmental benefits of doing something like that? Playing with toys, you know, just the concept of having a whole lot of toys to play with is potentially a foreign concept to many families, and so they may really value more the interactions between family members, and as opposed to a child playing on their own with materials or toys, that may be frowned upon, and that really a child, you know, interacting with their peers and with cousins and with family members may be a higher priority. And then things like sports, where perhaps some families may, you know, frown upon on gender issues around young girls playing with balls, but may more encourage boys. And again, not saying there's a right or a wrong to these types of things, but they're things to consider why families may be doing the things they are or not doing the things there are, that there may be some real cultural values that are associated with what they're doing with their young children and why. And it's our job to figure out what's going on with families by talking to them about this and really learning more from them about how they're rearing their young kids. In terms of communicating results, I think this is a really important part of this whole process, and it is regardless of whether there's real cultural issues that are coming into play. It's just a difficult thing often for providers to do, and obviously a lot of emotions come up during this process when there are problems or potential concerns identified. So really setting it up ahead of time, who should be involved in the discussion? Are the players there? Much in the same way as the introduction, there may be certain people that are decision makers within the family, and they need to be part of this conversation. What are appropriate follow-up activities? I heard a lecture by Barbara Rogoff where she discussed that in some of the research that she has done in cultures in Guatemala, a mother playing with her child may not seem appropriate, and yet it's a very common follow-up type of activity that we may encourage is to have play activities. And you could get down on the floor and play these games with your child, and that will be great. But these mothers really felt like their role in being with their children was as the caregiver. They were feeding their children, making sure they were safe, making sure they were healthy. It wasn't to play with their children. In that culture, you could still discuss play activities, but it may be more appropriate for siblings or other family members to be playing with the children as opposed to the mother. As a helper, you really bring your best remedy, and often those are good remedies. They may have a lot of evidence behind them in terms of good follow-up activities and things to do with young children. We know a lot as providers in terms of what has worked for other families and what the research shows us, but in the end it's going to be a collaboration with the parents, and in terms of what we are going to follow up on. A good example of this is just something like the common cold and what kind of remedies different people have for the common cold. Some people might immediately start taking a lot of vitamin C. Some people might start cooking up the chicken soup. Some people might get the echinacea. But and all of those have good components to them, and you're bringing one remedy potentially, or some different ideas about remedies, but the parents and caregivers may have very different remedies they're thinking may help this situation. And another one is just, if you're going to make a referral, to make sure that that community agency that you are referring this family to is ready for this referral and understands the family's cultural background, and it will be sensitive to that, and maybe that means you accompany them or help them with that referral process, but to consider that it may not just work to provide a number for a family to call, that really needs to be a sensitive process as well. These were recommendations for practitioners to gather information from family members when concerns arise. Different iterations of these questions have come up over time. There's maybe some that have more questions, such as a book, When the Spirit Catches You, You Fall Down, had a whole series of questioning that kind of follows this type of questioning sequence about gathering information when concerns arise. And so this would be the conversation that you might start having with a family when you have a concern or when a screening indicates a concern. Is there a problem? Does the family consider that this is even an issue? Why do you think there's a problem? What do you think caused it? What can be done? So what are their follow-up ideas? What interventions would be appropriate? And who can help or who should help? So just having these conversations with families will really help the understanding of what potential, what may be potentially, they may be thinking about what to do next. In terms of very specifically the ASQ, when you're looking at interpreting scores and making referrals, there's more than one thing to consider. And scores are just one piece of information. And they're important in that they give us some guidelines, but even when we are talking about assessing children from a very traditional Western context who are native English speakers, scores, again, do not give us all the information that we need. We need to consider other factors. Certainly when looking with families from other cultures, was an adaptation of the tools or a translation used? If not, what are the considerations around that for the family and for the child's scores? Overall responses, parent concerns, really important to take into mind, and then additional factors such as the health of the child, the setting where these screenings were conducted, whether or not there were additional factors like potential stress that may have been occurring that may have impacted the child's scores. And the big ones here are obviously the family culture and the home language. So what language was this child assessed, and was it an adaptation that was used? So perhaps the scores are very meaningless depending on what was going on in terms of the language that this assessment occurred. These are some recommendations, again, coming from this partnership in Canada, the Cross-Cultural Lessons, Early Childhood Developmental Screening and Approaches to Research and Practice. They listed a number of just recommendations, including considering families' pre- and post-immigration experiences if these are immigrant families. We talked earlier about using cultural brokers and interpreters is very important. We're going to talk a little bit later about some resources that are on agesandstages.com, a website, and one of them kind of lists out, sensitive use of interpreters when you're bringing interpreters in to translate the ASQ and work with families, and some of the considerations you need to consider when doing that. To really talk to families about their cultural expectations of development. Again, maybe look very, very different from our expectations of a child feeding themselves by the time they're, very, very young. That may not be an expectation until a child's a preschool age in another culture or older. To clarify the language and meaning, this is what, again, is getting at that intent issue. So that language is going to be one of the stickiest issues that comes up. So really to understand the intent of items and the meaning of them, and feel free to reframe them until there's clarity about that intent of what we're looking for in that item. Incorporating non-standardized methods into the screening process, which we are in many ways. There's many things about the ASQ process that is standardized in terms of how the tool is scored and what our cutoffs look like, things like that. But there are other non-standardized things. It does not have to be just administered by a professional to a child in a room. There's many different places and settings and ways that that tool can be administered. Interpret the results with caution, and we talked about that before, that really that's going to be very important, not to just take those cutoffs, to look at them, but consider them within the context of the child's culture. Debriefing the results with the family, determining that follow-up together we talked about, and throughout the process really validating that parents, their beliefs, their values, the way they are bringing up their young children. Another thing that's talked about a lot, and that many of you may have done a lot of work around, is just, just becoming more self-aware, to really, understand your own cultural framework, your worldview, what kind of privileged position you may or may not be coming from, to really think about culture from your history, from your community, the trainings that you've attended, and your work setting. What is the culture that you're really embedded in, and what messages did you receive about family interactions and child rearing, as with either your own experiences in the way you were parented, or how you are currently parenting, or how different family members tell you you should be parenting. That all of these have a lot of cultural messages, and we all hold them, what we believe to be sort of the right and the wrong way to potentially do things. So to really have some understanding of that, we do a training or an activity often in training where we try to tease this out a little bit, and it really is interesting. We've done not this particular one, but something similar to it, where we ask folks to say, how comfortable are you? Say, one of these questions down here is about breastfeeding babies past the age of 1 year, up to 3 years, or how do you feel about that? Is that something you feel comfortable with? Is it something that if you went into a home and this parenting practice was happening, how would you feel about it? What would be your first thought when you saw this? And it's quite remarkable how strongly some people feel. And we ask it from a couple different perspectives. We say, would this be how you would parent your child? And how comfortable do you feel with this parenting practice if you came across this in your work setting? So to have folks really think about, wow, I have I feel very comfortable with this if other people are doing it. I wouldn't necessarily do it myself, or didn't do it myself with my own children, but that would be fine if another family did it. I don't have any issues with that. But sometimes you get people who really strongly feel like that is totally the wrong thing to do with a child, and that is really going to be a bad thing for them over time. And I think it's important to realize that in yourself, and that all of the things that we're talking about are not things that are uncommon in different cultures, or to realize it about other, how you feel about other families doing this. So I just think it's a good thing to put those things on the table and find out how people are feeling about those things, and to remember to probably not try to jump to advice giving with families when you see something very different going on. Maybe to bring that information back to your work group, to folks who you trust, and talk about it and get some other perspectives on it and go, I don't think, maybe somebody else has a very different feeling about that particular practice, and that, as long as the child isn't being harmed emotionally or physically, that, there may be many benefits to that practice that you're not even aware of. I thought we could just add this in that it's a really great resource. And again, it's immigrant and refugee families in Canada. Obviously, there's going to be huge similarities between their experiences coming to Canada as as compared to the U.S. And it's a very nice resource, a handbook that you can download from their website, or that they can send you copies of, especially for the immigrant and refugee families. It's a nice resource.
So this is Jane, and I had planned to talk somewhat about research. What I think I'll do is just give a couple introductory slides and then get to your questions, because that's often the most interesting part for participants. Is hopefully some of the questions that were asked when people registered, I think we've answered, but I'm sure there's still some more, so we'd like to give you the opportunity to answer those. So this is just some examples of the translations or the adaptations of the ASQ and or the ASQ that are available. In some cases, it might be just 1 or 2 intervals that someone translated. For instance, the Dutch version, they've used the 48-month questionnaire to follow children who were premature in a medical setting. So some of them have limited intervals. Some of them are the whole series that are translated. And there's a link there to under languages on the agesandstages.com about these translations, and then also about who to contact. They're distributed in a different way than the English and the Spanish translations. These are some of the studies, and I'm going to, on the handout, hopefully that you can download, you can look at some of the studies, which I'm not going to go over in detail, but we need to look at these 4 factors when we're looking at an adaptation or a translation. Starting at the top on the right, functional. If you're translating, does the language have the same function in one setting or another, in one language or another? The linguistic, that's the language. For instance, the phrase in Spanish, "Do you have concerns?" I don't know Spanish, but it seems to be difficult for to translate, and also for families to make sense of. So thinking about how to ask things in a different language that's linguistically equal. The metric part is just measuring differences. Are the translations, is a language having the same function in terms of how parents are answering the questions, how the children are scoring? We've been using item response modeling to look at this metric equivalence between one translation or another. And finally, the 4th factor is what we spend a lot of time on, the cultural factor. Are these practices that are the same? Do they need to be asked a little bit differently in one culture or another? So Amy, I think I might just stop here, and I can go here to our final slide. Sorry, again, hopefully these will be available so that you can look at them. And Liz and I are also happy to have questions. If people want to email or to contact us, I'm happy to answer questions. So just to summarize, the ASQ and the ASQ-SE have been used successfully with families. We do have research that shows this, as well as many users who have just given us their clinical impressions. It's really important to consider the family's culture in order to have a valid and reliable look at that child's development. And we have research that supports the use of these tools with families from very diverse cultural backgrounds. Amy?
Great, thanks, Jane. And so the slides that were skipped were about some of the research that has been conducted on the Spanish version of the Spanish translation of the ASQ, and then I think there was a slide on using it in the Netherlands. So we'll send out a handout, especially with those slides, because we know we didn't get a chance to talk about all of those slides. So we will make sure that you get that information for everyone listening. Up here on your screen now, you'll see this is a slide about we're having the annual ASQ-3 and ASQ-SE Training Institute. So if you're interested in learning more, we'd love to have you come join us in Florida. Sue Yockelson, one of the ASQ contributing authors and one of the ASQ trainers who travels around the country training, she will be presenting the institute. It's a 3-day institute, and you learn all about how to use the ASQ-3 and ASQ-SE, and you actually become, it's a training of trainers, so you'll get PowerPoint slides to go back and train the staff at your program. So it's a great 3 days, and you get the chance to talk with other people who are using ASQ in different programs. And there is a code at the bottom there, so if you're interested, we're giving a $50 off registration if you use the code ATI50. And then I think there's so Jane, if you'll move forward one slide for me, we have some information about, we also offer on-site training by the ASQ authors and other trainers. So if you're interested in having one of the authors come to your site to do an introductory training on either ASQ-3 or ASQ-SE, or if you're interested in a training of trainers, please contact us. There's more information on our website, booksonlocation.com. And then one of the next slides, we're just giving everyone a 20% discount as a thank you for joining us for the webinar. So the code is up there, and that's good on any of the ASQ print products as well as any of the other Brooks books. So if you're interested, the learning activities, the ASQ-3 in English and in Spanish are both the newest ASQ products. So if you don't have those yet to share with families, those are really great handouts that you can share with the families after you do the screening. So you could use your discount code for those. So I think then, and Jane, I think the next slide is your contact information. There's some information up there. So now we have gotten lots of good questions. So if you have, listeners, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box now. And I'm going to start reading off some of those now. So, okay. So here's the first question. What are some best practices in using the ASQ with families when there's limited English skills and there isn't an interpreter present?
This was actually an interesting question because we hadn't talked about this a lot in training, but it obviously makes a huge amount of sense that you're going to have situations where a provider, a home visitor is going into a home. They maybe speak one language, the parent has maybe limited English, and yet, you know, they really have to complete this assessment. I think there's no very specific guidelines around this other than, you know, you do the best you can do to really get, you know, aside from just reading question items, you may want to demonstrate and use all your nonverbal communication skills like gesturing with your hands and modeling and pulling out items and pointing and all those things that very young kids do to get their points across to us, and often do quite effectively, to try to do your best job at really conducting the screening. I think that it's almost impossible to do a good job with making follow-up decisions and referring children based on a situation like this without getting a good interpreter to the table at some point. I'm not sure how you would do that in a really good way unless you do have that extra resource. I think you could probably gather quite a lot of information as a provider, though, on what a child's able to do by playing with them and, again, using your best nonverbal strategies.
Great. Thanks, Liz. We have a question in from a listener right now. So have you seen any trends in terms of how certain cultural populations tend to score on the ASQ-3 or the ASQ-SE?
This is Jane, and I think that it really depends on the language that it's being translated into. In general, there's not a huge differences in when we look at the means or the standard deviations. When we're asking about items such as using past tense, like I walked, I talked, that we'd have in English that in other languages are very different, I think that's when we see some differences. And also so the communication skills and also some of the cultural practices that are related to the self-help skills or the adaptive skills, as Liz mentioned, like dressing, feeding, that have, you know, toileting, diapering, that those have a cultural context. So we do see some then. But I think in general, we have been really surprised at how similar young children are around the world. One of the first translations was a Norwegian translator, and his, you know, he changed very few of the cutoff scores across all the intervals. This was the second edition of the ASQ, because there was so much similarity. And even in like Chile or in some of the African cultures, you would think that there would need to be more changes in the cutoff points. China is about to launch an online version of the ASQ. There are some, but there's fewer than you would expect across cultures. And I think partly it's because kids are so young and their development is unfolding. And I think as they get older, there's more cultural influences on their specific scores.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Another question here. So is it better or is it preferred to have the parent or the caregiver answer the question themselves, or for a home visitor to ask the questions in like an interview format? Does it matter?
That's a good question, and one that we get a lot. And how I would answer it, this is Jane, is that you really need to individualize for families. There are some parents who really enjoy kind of being empowered and answering the questions themselves. I think many families, though, welcome a chance to sit down and talk about their children. I think most people are very happy to talk about what their child can do. If the screener or the provider really sets up a kind of a mutually kind of just being really respectful and not saying, oh, this is what your child should be doing, but having some items out, having the child play, and then having them try a few of the items, that you can do it together and have that be interesting for both the screener or the provider as well as the family. So again, I think you have to individualize. There are some families, and this are some of the questions that we're often asked, if they can't read, you can't just give them a questionnaire. Or if they have low literacy rates in English and you only have an English translation, you can't expect them to do a very accurate job. So again, the individual characteristics of the family will make a difference. But and if providers have the time, I think it's really nice, at least for a couple questionnaires, to really sit down and do the questionnaire together.
Great. Well, your answer kind of segued into another question. We've had a couple questions submitted about low literacy, parents who have low literacy levels. And so someone asked for the reading level of the questionnaires. And so the ASQ-3 questionnaires, the reading level is between 4th and 6th grade. And I think the ASQ-SE questionnaires are a similar level. So do you have any recommendations for using it with parents who may have low literacy? I know you talked about an interview format, so that I think would work in that situation.
Yeah, the only thing to consider, I think, is not taking the process away from a parent. So, one of the issues might be, just how, again, that nonverbal communication, how somebody takes the questionnaire as a provider and has it on a clipboard and is completing it. And so what you might want to do is sit next to the parent, especially with the ASQ. It's very important that parents also can see the illustrations to help out with their choices in terms of what a child's able to do and not able to do. So either to sit really side by side with the parent while going through it, or to allow the parent to have a copy of it in front of them. People ask about that in terms of telephone. Is it okay to use over the telephone? Well, the parent should still really have a copy of the tool in front of them, not just be completely doing it as an interview. So yeah, to just give the parents the level of support they need while not taking the process away from them, or the home visitor provider not influencing the answers from their own, especially with the SE, their own opinion of a child's behavior, to really be gathering that information from the parent's perspective.
Great, thanks. We've had a couple questions about using the ASQ-3 with English language learners. And so one listener asked whether you could use the ASQ-3 when a child's learning more than one language, especially since some dual language learners tend to talk later. So is that a concern, or what adjustments would you suggest?
This is Jane. It really, again, depends individually on the child and the family. And I certainly, if a child was low in communication, they were learning 2 languages, I would not refer them, especially if they were kind of near our monitoring zone on the questionnaire, but try to follow them more frequently. Do a screening in 4 months again to see how their language or their literacy. I think that you can often tell, sometimes tell, if a child is really understanding the language, or if they're either language, or if they're really having a hard time with language in general. You know, and that's kind of the crux of the matter is it because they're English language learners, or is it because they're really having a hard time making sense out of communication? And if their nonverbal communication is really good, if they have a pretty good receptive language, and then you could also have the parents, you know, administer, if you will, that the communication items in their native language and see how they do in that to gather more information about the child. But again, it's clinical judgment in some ways, and not making sure that you don't refer a child just because they're English language learners and not because they're truly having developmental problems.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I just, if I could add just a little bit, Amy.
Of course.
Again, the communication area, and Jane started to talk about this around, but the research around that and the adaptations of that communication area are really some of the trickiest, you know, issues for language. And some languages, you know, one word may mean, you know, if a child's able to produce a word, it is, you know, maybe the equivalent of a 2 to 3 word utterance in the English language. So, you know, Spanish and some of those translations are not as much of an issue, but when they get translated or adapted into another language, the structure of language becomes really important. And I know there was a study done too about this issue of children learning more than one language at the same time. And as you all know, you know, the brain is just so working on communication and language in these early years that as long as kids are learning to, you know, like if they're learning English but very consistently, you know, speaking a home language at home, their delays aren't big. They're small. And like Jane said, you want to really, they should not, you shouldn't give them too much time as that as an excuse. Really, kids are raring to go with learning, and they sort it out pretty darn fast if they're learning 2 good models of a language. So to not let that be an excuse not to refer them relatively quickly, but really keep an eye on them, as Jane was saying.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to share a comment from one of our listeners. This individual just said that she's read the book When the Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, and she highly recommends it. So for everyone listening, if you're interested, she said it's a great book.
By Anne Fadiman, just in case people want to look it up.
Okay, Liz, can you repeat that? I think you went out right as you said that.
Sorry, Anne Fadiman is the author of that book, and it is a really fascinating issue of what can potentially go wrong if it's really focused on health services interfacing with a family from a very different cultural background. But it's very, very interesting and has a lot of good lessons in it and suggestions for practitioners.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think we're running close to the end of our time here, but I just have a couple more questions. And then if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll get in touch with you to make sure that we get your questions answered. And some of these, I think it would be good we could answer them on our Ages and Stages website, because I'm sure there are other people who are interested in the same questions. We had a couple people ask during the registration process, what do you do when a parent hasn't given a baby or a child the opportunity to try a skill or a task?
As we mentioned when we were talking about the cultural adaptability of the ASQ and the ASQSE, that you can omit items, and that's what we'd recommend is if the parent really hasn't had a chance or doesn't want to administer or can't for whatever reason to omit that item. As Liz said earlier, it's really important to have some sense, or to try to get some sense, especially if you're a home visitor, is this an item that's culturally inappropriate? Is it one that we just need to omit and not try? Or is it one the child hasn't had a chance to do this? They haven't used crayons or pencils. We need to see if the family can give them some time with practicing these skills that they haven't had opportunities yet. So kind of making those distinctions, but just, you know, on the surface, the best thing to do is to omit that item follow up with the child if there's still concerns, either in a couple months, re-administering the next screening interval, and also seeing if why that item was omitted. If you have the opportunity to have a discussion with the family about it.
Great, thanks. And we've got a couple comments of people asking for the name of the book we were just talking about. So I'll send that out in the follow-up email. That way you have the title and the author of that book in case you're interested in reading it. And then I think as a last question, we had a couple people ask about what you should do if the ASQ relies on the parents to provide the responses. So what should you do if you think the parent might be exaggerating the child's ability, or do you recommend, someone asked if they recommended that the provider try some of the activities with the child themselves?
I think it can be very tricky in terms of you want to really respect the family and to really trust them and to have a relationship with them. And I think that there are often families see different samples of behavior. They may see children, talking in 3 or 4 word sentences all the time. But when they're around strangers, they're shy or they're reserved, or it's a cultural value not to talk a lot, so that the home visitor or the assessor wouldn't have that same sample of behavior. So I think you have to be very careful about, again, having this judgment about, oh, families always exaggerating. They're always saying their children can do more. Again, if you have the opportunity to sit down and try items, you could, but I wouldn't take the questionnaire away and say, oh no, let's have the child do this. It has to be done in a respectful way, and it may be even on the next screening interval if you're really concerned that a child isn't doing something, doesn't have a skill that you think is key to their development. You can also have the practitioner or another caregiver complete a questionnaire, and it's not that you have a right or a wrong one, but you have 2 different perspectives or 2 different views of that child, and it's a good place for a conversation, to start a conversation that's not value-laden, but it's just, let's talk about your child and kind of what we're seeing in terms of their skills.
Yeah, and I would just add that, this comes up a lot in training, and to just be careful, when you administer these tools, you may want to set it up right away that we're just going to try all these items right now. We may need to wait over a bit of time. We may not see them all today. So to kind of set it up that there is an expectation that you'll try items with families, but when it comes down to who's right or who's wrong, just to keep in mind that the most important thing as a provider that often you're going in to do is to develop that relationship with the family and to develop trust with that family. And so you don't want to kind of jump in there and potentially go, I think you're wrong here, and I'm going to rescore this one. That you could do a wait and see. You could come back in another couple months and do it sooner. Another thing that may be coming in for families is really, I think one thing we can do as providers is also let parents, especially parents from really diverse backgrounds who may be coming to this country or unfamiliar with what the expectations for children will be once they reach kindergarten, is to just let them know, these are the types of things in our community that when kids get to kindergarten, they, want them to know. And again, we're not going to influence what their ultimate decision is, but we're letting them know kind of if they're planning on staying in this community, if what's going to be expected of their child if they're going to send them to our school systems. And so that's just another thing that we may want to prepare families for, is just to give them that information and let them do with that what they will.
Great, thanks. So I know I said that was the last question, but this one's an easy question, so I'm going to read. We have a listener asked about finding the procedures for scoring the questionnaires when you have omitted items, and I know that question comes up a lot, so that information is included in the user's guide for the tools, and then also for the ASQ-3 we have a quick start guide that includes a nice chart that shows what the adjusted scores look like when you omit items. So that's in the quick start guide's a little 4-page folded folded guide that you can kind of, it's a lot easier to transport around than the whole user's guide, and it has a lot of that information you need right at your fingertips, like the different age administration dates, and then the adjusted scoring for the omitted items. So Jane and Liz, thank you so much for presenting the webinar, and thank you for everyone who's listening. We are really glad to have so many people listening with us, and we were all glad to hear the information you were presenting.
You're most welcome.
And so there's a recording. We've recorded this, and we will be sending a link tomorrow with the recording, and then we'll also make sure to get a handout of the slides to everyone too, because we know that we missed covering some of those research slides. So we'll make sure, and the name of the book as well, as someone just typed in. So we'll send that out too. So thank you so much for everyone who's listening, and have a great rest of your day.